Magic gates, apparently caused by some magical phenomenon at one moment, appeared all over the world. Even in high-altitude mountains, shrouded in a ton of snow, similar magical objects appeared among travelers who organized an expedition. They were in all corners of the world, not excluding hot countries where carefree children could play ball next to this phenomenon because it turned out that the gate is harmless to the human body. They could have been in the very center of the city, at rush hour, when people were frantically rushing about their business, but even so their exact purpose was not revealed. The news was always talking about the appearance of this gate, and as the cases became more frequent, more and more people began to worrying about it. Through experiments, scientists are still trying to figure out the cause of this phenomenon, as well as the possibility that the gate is associated with the recent appearance and disappearance of living monstroid creatures. Here the gate, located at the high-rise building, did not interfere at all with the workers who managed to load everything. Colleagues stood next to each other while the boss threw a bottle of water for Yujin because he realized that the box was heavy, while the woman praised the guy for his efforts, calling his arms strong. The guy grinned sheepishly, opening a bottle of water. Colleagues looked at the young man and began to wonder why he took this difficult job, supposedly paying for his studies at the university. The guy replied that he was working to pay for his younger brother's university education. The woman asked whether he was paying for it. He shows a photo of himself and his younger brother together on his phone, saying that he does not consider this torment. The woman takes the phone in her hand. At this time the guy points to his younger brother, while the colleague notes the attractiveness and neatness of the guy. Yujin agrees with her words. The woman holds the phone in her hand and awkwardly looks at the young man who stands opposite her and talks in detail about his younger brother. The guy takes the phone and shows it to his surprised colleagues standing opposite them, while the woman is perplexed by his detailed story about their life, to which the boss says with a smile that this always happens when it comes to his younger brother. Yujin smiles and happily announces that his brother's classes also end early today. Yu Haiyan's hands were clasped on his briefcase, while Yu Haiyan happily told his colleagues that he would run to him immediately after work to eat meat. Yu Haiyan was sitting on a train full of people. His gaze was fixed on the window. The same gate could be seen in the distance, while his older brother admitted that the work was becoming more and more, although he saw the advantages in it. The blue body of the truck, where the boxes were located, drove calmly along the road, while Yujin noted that now is not the moving season, although there is no other season. The young man clarifies, while the man points out the window, talking about how more and more people are feeling discomfort because of this thing, which is why they are moving. Another orange gate hung above the street, not far from a high-rise building. The man notes that it would be nice to know the purpose of the gate, because he had vague doubts. The orange gate suddenly sparkled. Yujin didn't even have time to express his doubts about the fact that the gate was blue before. The guy screams and gets pretty scared. All three sat in shock at what had happened. The boss was wondering what it was. The woman looked around in fear, asked if someone had crashed. The guy was in a hurry, getting ready to go out to check the integrity of the things in the boxes. Yujin opens the truck door, looking towards the back of the truck. In front of him, on the back of the truck, sat a huge monster, drooling, looking at the guy. The young man opened his eyes wide, speechless with horror. The monster notices the guy and grins, clearly intending to attack him. It sharply attacks the guy, who jumped back, screaming in horror. The monster suddenly rushes towards Yujin and crashes his head into the truck because the guy managed to dodge by bending over and covering his head with his hands. The monster overturned the truck while the young man, sitting on the asphalt, screamed in fear, wondering what kind of creature it was. His colleagues were still inside, screaming in horror. Yujin's face is filled with fear. He assumes that it is a monster. Not realizing what it really is, his frightened gaze rushes to the right. Monsters appeared in a heap from the gate and flew at the frightened townspeople who were running away from them. The gates are still sparkling while these monsters appear from them, and as it turned out, they were connected to the dungeon, otherwise, to another world, from where these creatures entered the world of people. Monsters attacked people, mercilessly grabbing them, but as it turned out, the uncleared and abandoned dungeon burst, reaching overflow. Yujin grabbed a strong stick and ran towards the monster, screaming. Swinging at this beast from behind, the guy wanted this lizard to get out of the truck right away. His face became frightened. He was ready to fight this monster. However, someone else's strong hands managed to stop this creature by forcefully opening its mouth wide. The guy's boss struggled to get out of the truck, still opening his mouth to the monster, while her husband was shocked by what was happening. Her hands took on an unusual purple color while she restrained the beast and told the man to get out while there was still a moment, but he, in turn, did not understand what had happened to her. Drops of sweat were running down the woman's face. She shouted to her husband that she herself did not understand everything that had happened. In fact, it turned out that there were people who awakened their abilities when encountering monsters. There was an accident and fire on one of the roads. The awakened became hunters, who had to clear the dungeons. Hunters soon became the most sought-after profession in the world. The demonic beast was burning dead. Those around were horrified after the attack. They looked at the burning monster and at Yu Yun standing in front of the monster as his hands emitted a black and purple aura. He looked at the monster. His shirt was ruined from the battle with the monster. His tie and hair were blowing in the wind. He looked at his hands in surprise. Not believing his eyes, he became an S-class hunter, of which there were only a few. 8 years later, the Republic of Korea. Sole cloudless weather reigned over the city. The girl's hand caused an unusual phenomenon of green light. She asked if people could see it. The reporter, standing in front of the girl in a light green sweater, answered in the negative because she saw nothing. She replied that this was a status window that only she could see. A pretty girl with brown eyes and brown hair, wearing a cute sweater, who was looking at the magical phenomenon, replied that at first she thought that she was in a game. The glowing sprout logo, surrounded by a circle, had an inscription beneath it calling on nature to become greener. It was a skill that grew trees in a specific area. Yumi explained that this status window contains a list of skills that she can use. For example, a girl falls to her knees with a roar, touching the tiles with her hands, from which tree vines instantly grew, reaching upward, surprising the journalists present there. Soon the vines intertwined with each other, right up to the ceiling. Inscriptions appeared in the frame with the names of the program and a similar phenomenon. People were delighted with this ability, asking if people were saved with the help of this power. Yumi lived among garbage in a terrible room, overgrown with mold and moss, 8 years ago while looking for work during a dungeon strike. Then she was able to grow wooden vines and save people by awakening her skill, and recently she saved people from a falling building in a similar way. The girl absent-mindedly put her hand behind her neck, talking about how she was in a hurry and didn't notice it herself. A small guild posed near the cleared portal. It was then that Yumi chose the profession of a hunter. A middle-aged woman with short hair, pulled back into a ponytail, stood with her back in front of shelves with unusual contents. Pointing at them with her left thumb, she talked about how the items obtained in the dungeon cost a lot of money. The magical crystals glowing with a purple light, floating above a group of hunters, were called magic stones, and only hunters with good skills could get them. Thanks to this thing, they could sit on a whole lot of money because they were worth from several hundred to several billion. Yu Hyun especially stands out, looking to the side with a thoughtful expression on his face. He is quite famous. He was still a high school student at the time of his awakening. The small guild emerged from the gates and was greeted by the paparazzi. Yu Yun, who lost his parents at an early age and lived in poverty, founded a guild, which everyone calls the Abyss, after his awakening. Behind the guy stood a rather strong man, and another guy was walking not so far behind them. Yu Yun is already 25 years old, and many cannot even imagine its condition. The reporter holds out the microphone to Yumi, who was at a loss. She was asked about her condition, to which the girl replied that this was impossible because she was E-class. However, clenching her hand into a fist and closing her eyes, she answered enthusiastically that if she continued to work, she would be able to save money for her younger sister's education. Then the screen darkens and an inscription appears on half the screen about the death of the huntress. This was her last interview because she died while clearing the dungeon. A whole group of rescuers carried Yumi's body while others tried to help the rest of the hunters. In the morning, the girl's body was taken to the hospital, but she was unable to recover. A huge crowd of people gathered in front of the portal and stood behind the fence while preparations were made. The gates sparkled, shimmering blue. The hunters were gathering for the next cleanup, preparing their weapons. At this time, one guy in a red uniform called out to his superior, who was nearby in a blue uniform and getting ready, asking about a Class F person. Yujin was sitting on a chair, bending over, wearing a black cap, mask, and fingerless gloves. His crutches lay nearby, while the others scurried around. He is a Class F hunter nicknamed Educator. Yujin darkened, looking at the guy who called him a magnet for trouble, because many times it happened that all the members of the squad died while he miraculously remained alive. In general, a bad sign. Yujin clasped his fingers together as he listened to how things were so bad that his younger brother abandoned him. The guy in red took out his phone, Starting to read the article while the blonde hunter was behind him, he began to read an article about how Yujin did not visit Yuyun in the hospital when his leg was crushed into powder, and the blonde asked him to stop discussing the younger one. Suddenly, Yujin's hand grabs the guy's t-shirt as he continues to read the article, calling his little brother disgusting. He pulls the guy towards him, threateningly telling him to shut up. The young man looked furiously at his opponent, cutting off his words by saying that this was no one's business. The guy in the red uniform grins at first, raising his hands, taking on a harmless position. Next, he pushes Yujin away from him with a kick in the leg, spreading his arms to the side, causing the lower one to fall, shouting that he doesn't dare to attack like that. Now he grabs Yujin by the collar, who is trying to understand what happened. The guy lifts him off the ground, clearly demonstrating his strength to him while the blonde was nearby. Yujin opened his eyes slightly, grabbing the offender's hand while he shouted that he did not dare to dig into Class D. Then the guy lets go of his victim, causing him to fall to the ground with a roar, while he himself began to move away, throwing words at him that he could complain about it to your brother. The blonde notes that this behavior occurs every time his younger brother is mentioned. Yujin grabs his leg, trying to come to his senses. Opening his eyes, he sees in front of him the hand of a man who used his power. Yujin looks in surprise at Seokwoo, who caused a flash of light with his power, crouched in front of him and complained about what happened because they didn't even have time to enter the dungeon yet. Yujin frowned as he listened to him say that because of his class, he would have to rely on someone and have to endure it. The young man smiles radiantly, closing his eyes. He accepts the help of the boss with a smile, who extended his hand to him and tried to help him get up, while Yujin thanked him for being accepted into the dungeon, despite his level. They clasped their hands tightly, while the young man said that Seokwoo himself works hard, reconciling his subordinates. The boss lit up with happiness after hearing his words of gratitude and noted that Yujin is the only one who notices his efforts. The young man looked at him, a little nervous, thinking about the fact that he had been exposed. Yujin hurriedly picks up his cap from the ground. Next, on crutches, the guy walks behind his squad, looking at how the boss slaps the offender on the head with the words that he should stop bothering the young man because he is as useful as the others and has enough experience, and with him the purge will go quickly. Yujin used his power to test the subject's upbringing, which he called out mentally. While the boss was diligently scolding his subordinates, Yujin added the head of the guild to the objects of education and almost agreed with the words of his offender. Seokwoo gathered the squad around him and gave the order to enter, urging Yujin to catch up with them on crutches, mentally noting that he had always survived thanks to his skill. We were transported to the dungeon area. Huge old walls with small gates were surrounded by tree roots. Two huge and terrible bats were moving straight towards the guys. The guys from the guild began to defend themselves from the giant monsters, hiding behind their shields and using their magical powers. One of the giant bats' corpses lay on the ground. The guys grinned at this, realizing that during the strike into the dungeons, they were shivering at the mere sight of such creatures. Suddenly, the monster's corpse began to evaporate and turn into a sparkling crystal. Seokwoo and the guy in the red jacket watched the sparkling crystal with delight. Seokwoo didn't expect that they could earn so much from one monster. The F-class player noticed that the crystal was large, realizing that with such a size, even a D-class magic stone would cost several hundred. The protagonist looked at the guy with an anxious look and held a small crystal in his hand. He replied that he did not find anything serious, except for small stones that could be considered waste. Yujin turned around in frustration and began hammering on the walls with his pickaxe. He was very angry that he was mistaken for cheap labor, comparing himself to Cinderella. Yujin humbly lowered his head, realizing that he was like a young orphan. Yujin lost his parents, and even his younger brother turned his back on him. Yujin recalled how his younger brother Yuyun came to the door and was about to leave, taking his backpack with him. Yuhyun in his cloak stood on a stone ledge surrounded by his comrades in black jackets. Yujin remembered that, while he was in the army, his brother gathered hunters and created the Abyss Guild, and as the Abyss was recognized as the strongest guild in the country, Yuyun became somehow unattainable. The main character recalled with longing how his brother's entire squad left him alone. Yujin humbly lowered his head at that moment, leaving him completely alone. From such a situation, when he was left alone, he clenched his fists tightly. He felt that he was unlucky and did not awaken, although he really wanted to. A bunch of all sorts of papers and cards were floating in the air, as if the wind had blown on them. Yujin then spent all the money left after quitting his job and found a broker who was supposed to awaken him. He recalled that he fell for their flattering interactions, that they would take care of him since he was an S-class brother. He recalled that he had done a lot of bad things, after which he was still able to awaken only to the F class, realizing that his brother had received the highest rank. Yujin's slender fingers touched the scattered newspapers and papers. He remembered that his name was always mentioned in the press, and he fell into a debt trap. Yu-yun looked with disgust at his little brother, who was sitting on the floor with his head down. Yu-yun then noted that Yujin should have been ashamed of such a nickname. Yu-yun arrogantly leaned towards his saddened brother and stated that he was not a teacher at that moment, but simply a burden that prevented him from moving on. The protagonist desperately stretched his hand after his brother, who indifferently stood with his back to him. Yu-hya noticed at that moment that everything turned out very well, because Yujin would no longer get into trouble in the dungeon. Yu-hyan looked at his brother with disgust and told him to live calmly and quietly from now on, and not interfere with his younger brother's development further. A strong blow from the pick broke off a piece of stone from the rock. The protagonist looked down sadly, whose face was covered in abrasions covered with bandages. The words that came out of Yujin's mouth were that he truly deserved to be abandoned. The main character continued to recall with annoyance how his brother, surrounded by his guild comrades, went towards his adventures. Yujin thought of himself as the weak older brother of the great S-class hunter, like a parasite trying to extract benefits from him, suddenly noting that this was not a delusion. In the dark and dusty space of the dungeon, Yujin continued to work with his pickaxe. The protagonist realized that he was an F-class hunter and was still able to survive in a dungeon where people constantly died, only thanks to one skill that took advantage of others. Yujin looked forward with a cold gaze. In the past, his nickname is Teacher. Yujin's silhouette was illuminated by the dim light. As he sat on a chair with everyone he knew and his brother in the background, he knew that this ability, given to him upon awakening, allowed him to influence those around him. Joyful and inspired, Yujin and his brother headed forward. He recalled he could influence from someone close to him, just like his brother, whom he personally cared for and raised, to people he met and became friends with. Yujin recalled how he brought glasses to his boys, who did not appreciate it. He used his code word for such subjects, cheer up, and they immediately became his pupils. The protagonist crawled out of cover and directed a green aura from his hands towards his guys. He used the small buff to their development, because this was his main skill as a teacher. Yujin swung his pickaxe, throwing it behind his head. He wondered how it was possible to survive with such a skill in the dungeon, even if the F-class was purely a support. Yujin watched with wide-eyed horror at the explosion in which his comrades died. He was considered a cave cricket, like a parasite that survived alone, even when everyone else in his team died. Yujin watched from a high ledge as a huge lizard monster killed two of his comrades. Ygo knew that he survived not because he was lucky, and not because he was constantly in the rear. Yugio tried to get his dagger from behind his back. In fact, the teacher had another hidden skill. It was this skill that saved him every time in a crisis, and it was thanks to it that he could survive, despite the death of everyone else. The main character widened his eyes and looked down in surprise. Notification: the effect of the title teacher appears. The additional skill Last Retribution is launched. The protagonist swung his pickaxe and noticed how it began to glow in his hands, realizing that his additional skill should now be activated. Notification: the skills and abilities of the object of education are transferred twice as much. Yujin looked at his pickaxe in amazement as he held it in his hands. He felt the power flowing into him and the abilities of his boss too. A magic circle with a pattern of increasing strength appeared near Yujin's pickaxe. The teacher immediately froze and opened his mouth, throwing his pickaxe to the ground. Yujin desperately rushed forward, jumping on his crutches. He understood that this could not happen in a D-class dungeon. He understood that this was a hidden skill, the Last Retribution. The hieroglyph of the tombstone in the red circle glowed in the air. The abilities and skills of the pupil, improved by him, were temporarily transferred to him with redoubled force. A huge tunnel in the cave led to the exit. Yujin knew that if the student's speed was 100, then he would be able to run at a speed of 200, and his strength would also be twice as strong. The main character walked forward in a daze and stopped in the moment, his eyes wide. He knew that thanks to this skill, he always survived, but he still considered it an unimaginably bad skill since the condition for activating it was very painful. Yujin sat on that very chair, surrounded by all his friends, whose faces were crossed out with a red cross, except for his brother. The teacher understood that the very fact of activating this skill meant a very bad event. Yujin mentioned his boss Sayakwu, whose face was also crossed out with a red cross. Yujin didn't believe that anything bad could happen to his boss. Yujin reached the spot and stepped into a pool of blood. The main character saw a bloody gorge in front of him, and the corpses of his team lay there. Yujin knew that the fact of activating the skill meant the death of the object. The protagonist looked in horror at Seokwu's bloody and lifeless body, trying to call out to him. The teacher turned his gaze upward to the screens. Yujin looked up and saw a huge angry dragon, which was holding in its mouth the guy in the red jacket with whom he had a conflict. Yujin looked on with alarm as blood sprayed from the sky from the dragon's mouth. Two angry dragon heads looked at Yujin. He realized that it was the king of the dragons of poison and curses, Lachetus. A huge and angry dragon stood on a rock and looked at little Yujin, who stood in front of a pool of blood and a pile of corpses of his comrades. The teacher did not understand why such a monster was in this place. The three-headed dragon Lachetus was on a rocky ridge and looked around. The main character looked at the dragon with horror, realizing that this simply could not happen. One of the dragon's heads glared at Yujin and opened its mouth. The teacher understood that he was in a D-level dungeon. Yujin ran back sharply, throwing his bones to the sides as the enraged dragon tried to eat him. The protagonist did not understand why a Class 1 dragon family like Lachetus was in this dungeon. Yujin's foot glowed with a bright light and barely touched the ground. He used the leg enhancement skill. With quick movements of his feet, Yujin was able to run into a small cave. Looking dumbfounded, he understood that he had a superior skill, strengthening the D-class frame, having twice its effect. Yujin saw in the distance a small gorge in the rock that he needed to run into. He was going to use this speed to hide where this monster couldn't catch him. Right in front of Yujin, an angry dragon swung its tail and blocked the path in front of the gorge, destroying the entire land. Yujin pulled his crutches aside and looked down as a deep hole appeared in front of him after the collapse, into which the dragon dived. Dinner looked on anxiously as the enraged Lachetus advanced towards him, swinging its tail. He thought that if he could strengthen his arms, he would block the blow. At that same second, with a light and quick swing of its tail, the dragon threw Yujin's body high. The main character flopped to the ground with his whole body. From such a strong fall, Yujin's blood dripped onto the ground. Yujin was lying on the ground and, raising his hand, noticed with a frightened expression that blood was flowing from his nose. The enraged Lachetus did not move far and was about to complete his attack. The teacher understood that he could not match the dragon, even with twice the strength of the boss's skill. The protagonist recalled the last minutes of his team's life, where the boss held the wounded body of a fighter, telling him that even a healing potion would not have helped. Yujin felt like he was being covered with dying memories. The guy in the red shirt and Yujin's memories turned back angrily, preparing to fight alone, yelling at his superior to hide in the corner. With sorrow, the main character recalled the moment of his death when the guy was going to gain time, but did not have time, and he was overtaken by death in the form of a dragon, and all his blood fell on the face of the boss. The wounded Yujin scrambled on the ground, realizing that he could suffer the same fate. Yujin couldn't walk, and so he crawled on the ground. Dragging his feet on the ground, he understood that with such legs, he could not escape. The exhausted main character raised his head and watched as the dragon advanced towards him in anger. He understood that in the end, he would die. The enraged dragon opened its mouth and was about to pounce on Yujin, who closed his eyes tightly and awaited his death. Suddenly, a powerful and strong explosion sounded right in front of the dragon, causing it to start shaking its heads. At the same second, Yujin's immobilized and humble body was picked up by his younger brother. The main character lay on Yuyun's back and, widening his eyes, hopefully said the name of his younger brother. Yuyun managed to hide his brother behind a block of stone and told him to stay behind the stone, as he was going to deal with the monsters himself, taking out his long sword. Yujin looked out from behind the stone, dumbfounded, trying to convey to his brother that even he could not cope with the three-headed enemy. Yuyun straightened his shoulders proudly and threw his sword aside, looking straight into the face of the enraged Lachetus. Yuyun whispered quietly, then he activated the blue willow leaf skill. At the same instant, Yuhyan's entire angry silhouette was surrounded by a blue magical aura with blue leaves. Yuhyan, with a deft movement of his body, jumped away from these leaves floating in the air. Yuhyan deftly swung through the air, flying past the dragon's heads, floating in his magical aura with his sword. Yuhyan held the handle tightly when suddenly it glowed with a bright purple aura. Yuyun frowned at the dragon, and with a wave of his hand, summoned a wave of purple magical aura. The protagonist's younger brother looked down in disdain, pointing his reincarnated purple sword towards the dragon. Yu Yun attacked the dragon from the air, trying to thrust his sword into the La Cheetah's dragon. Yujin watched in admiration as the fight between his brother and the angry dragon took place, realizing that his brother's attacks were too fast. Yu Yun looked down at the dragon with disdain. He continued to point his sword towards the dragon, with his hand raised above the hilt. The main character understood that this was an S-class battle. Yu Yun cast a questioning glance to the side when he saw that one of the dragon's heads was trying to pounce on him from the side. Wei Haiyan quickly flew into the air, trying to dodge the green poisonous stream from the dragon's mouth, which was supposed to incinerate him. Yu Yun, realizing that there was no way his brother would have time to dodge this poisonous attack, rushed to his brother's aid, putting his sword in front of him, using the activation of a giant shield. Yu Yun bared his teeth in pain as some of the poison still got into him. Yu Jin was very worried about his brother and shouted his name as Yu Haiyan looked towards the dragon with anger and contempt. Yu Haiyan swung his sword away from the dragon's poisonous attack, and all the sweat of the poison was thrown aside. Yu Haiyan looked worriedly as his sword melted from the dragon's poisonous attack. Yu Jin watched his brother with despair, realizing that the blade of the sword would no longer help them. The main character carefully watched the intense fight of his brother, who confidently fought with La Cheetah's. Yujin did not understand the behavior of his brother, who tried to protect him in this way, noting to himself that his brother could fight more freely. Yu Yun, with a quick movement of his body, again tried to dodge the dragon's poisonous spit, throwing an angry look at him from behind. Yujin understood that this was the only way his brother could protect both of them. Yu Yun turned his attention to the undead Yujin team. Yu Yun offendedly shouted to his brother that he went into the dungeon without knowing his place at all, which all led to sad consequences. Yu Yun sarcastically asked his brother about how long he plans to leave a trail behind him to clean up after him. Yu Yun frowned at his older brother, who fearfully raised his head up. Haiyan remarked rudely to his brother that he constantly told him that he should have lived quietly and peacefully. The teacher ironically asked his brother that he had come to the battlefield to express all this to his face. The dragon opened its mouth angrily. Yujin tried to ironically tease his brother about how he was already tired of his older brother's tutelage. The main character could barely stand on his feet, but still tried to move forward. Yu Yun looked at his brother angrily. Lowering his head down, Yu Haiyan stood his ground and tried to tell his brother not to come out and hide, but Yu Jin got tired of hiding in the shadows and started his own plan. Yu Jin grabbed his sword and attacked the dragon, trying to thrust his blue aura sword deeper. Yu Haiyan held his sword out in front of him as one of the dragon's heads approached him. Yu Haiyan didn't understand what his older brother was doing. Yu Jin let go of the sword and threw it to the ground. Jin humbly lowered his head, throwing the sword from his hands. The main character was offended by such injustice because he understood that if his brother saved him, he would again become a burden to him, so he decided for himself that Yu Haiyan left him to die. The protagonist frowned forward. He replied with self-irony that even for someone who died in a dungeon, there would be no need to arrange a funeral. Yujin once again remembered the moment when the entire team turned away from him and left. He felt that he was already tired of such a life. Yujin raised his head and spread his arms to the side, watching as he was about to be devoured by the enraged dragon. Yujin closed his eyes tightly, already mentally preparing for death. Yu Yeon immediately spread his hand to the side, trying to strike with his purple aura. Yu Yeon flew with all his might to help his brother, whose silhouette humbly stood on the ground and was almost overtaken by the paw of a dragon with sharp claws. A powerful explosion occurred, from which a violet aura intertwined with poisonous gusts. Drops of blood appeared on the ground. Yujin widened his eyes and abruptly averted them to the side. Yujin lay on the ground and looked towards his brother, who decided to save him, sacrificing his body, receiving huge holes from the dragon's claws. Yujin wondered since when did things go wrong for them. Yujin knew that they were brothers who had no one else. The main character recalled a sad moment when he and his brother were at the wake of their parents. A photograph of their parents stood near white flowers with sorrow. The protagonist noted that it was hard for them after the death of their parents. At that moment, their sad gazes crossed as Yujin held a flower in his hands. Then little Yu Haiyan became interested in how his older brother felt. The brothers held hands and planned to cook dinner together. They understood that in the whole world, they were the only ones who had each other. Drops of blood continued to drip from Yuyan's body. Yujin was alarmed that his brother had received such deep wounds and tried to call out to him, asking if he was okay. Yujin held the exhausted and wounded body of his brother as a huge and ferocious dragon destroyed the entire earth and its path to get to the guys. The ferocious dragon was burning in flames when Yuyun showed signs of life and rested his hand on the ground. Yuyun turned to his older brother with a heavy sigh, telling him that La Cheetahs falls asleep every 5 hours. The main character looked dumbfounded at his brother, who noticed to him that if he held on for another hour, the monster would fall asleep. Yujin again remembered the moment when the guards carried him out of the office with crutches. Yujin remembered that, even when his bones were crushed into small pieces, Yu Yeon never visited him in the hospital. Yu Yeon at the same moment desperately reached out his hand to his brother, who stood indifferently in the distance. Yujin remembered that even when he asked his brother for help, he pushed him away with extreme coldness. The memory of the main character remains that very painful moment when his younger brother looked at him with contempt, who abandoned him and told him to live quietly. Without sticking his head out, Yujin was very worried about the question, why now his brother came to the rescue, and began to smile. Exhausted, Yuyun held out a small yellow stone with his last breath, telling his brother to take the stone. Yujin extended his hand, and Yuyun gave him the stone, telling him that it was the gate stone with which he could get out. Yujin grabbed his brother, who sighed heavily, and held onto his wounds on his body. The teacher understood that he could not take the stone, since it was more important to heal the wounds on his brother's body. Yu Hyan, with a bloody face, looked humbly at his brother. Yu Hyan added that he would not be able to use the gate stone. Yu Hyan put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Yu Hyan was living the last seconds of his life and fell exhausted on his brother's body. Yujin looked frantically at his brother, who lay motionless with his eyes closed, and tried to call out to him. The protagonist looked forward in shock as a bright blue light shone in front of him. Yujin continued to hold his brother's immobilized body as a magical blue funnel appeared near them. The effect of the title of teacher has appeared. The duration of the additional skill, the last reward, is 1 hour. The main character watched in numbness as everything around them was surrounded by a blue magical aura. Notice that the skills and abilities of the deceased Yuan have been transferred to Yujin with double strength. The enraged dragon, along with its 3 heads, opened its mouth as Yujin's body was pierced by a bright blue light. The protagonist raised his head to the dragon, baring his teeth. The dragon La Cheetahs struck the place where the 2 brothers were with his powerful paw, destroying the entire earth. Yujin, with the help of his brother's blue magic beam skills, was able to dodge the dragon strike, flying into the air and holding his deceased brother's body. The main character landed nearby. Yujin suddenly and reverently clutched the body of his late brother, calling him a fool. Suddenly, power with a purple magical aura began to flow through Yujin's fingers. A magical purple spear appeared in front of Yujin, which he was about to take. Yujin held this spear in his hands and bowed before the deceased body of his younger brother, which lay on the cold ground. Yujin continued to hug his deceased brother's body, holding his staff in front of him as protection. Yujin pointed out that he should make it a brother even until the very end. A ferocious dragon was approaching the main character, who was looking at the dead body of his brother with mental pain. At the same instant, Yujin flew into the air and with a deft wave of his hands dealt a crushing blow to the dragon with his spear. Yujin, looking out from under his long bangs at the dragon, I noticed that he carried out the attack slowly. In a furious look, the main character swung his spear and was about to destroy the dragon that killed his brother by piercing the body of La Cheetahs. Yujin held the spear menacingly and noticed that he had twice the strength of his incredible brother. Yujin held onto his spear tightly as the dragon fell from such a powerful blow, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Yujin realized that along with the power, he also received the memories of his younger brother. In Yuyun's memories, he was holding his brother's card, noticing that Yujin had awakened as an F-class. Yuyun carefully examined his brother's file and realized that he should not have contacted his brother. The protagonist soared into the air and aimed at the dragon with his angry gaze, swinging his staff. Gaining great speed, Yujin landed and ran towards the dragon, who was waiting for him. With a deft movement, he jumped away from the dragon's head. Flying high into the air, Yujin swung his spear. Aiming with his gaze, Yujin was about to deliver a crushing blow under La Cheetahs. Yu Hyan was then in the hospital with his leg and arm bandaged. Yuyun was very angry with himself for not being able to prevent the moment for his brother to remain unharmed and not lie in a hospital bed. The main character noticed the moment when his angry younger brother ordered his assistants to deal with the scoundrels who broke Yujin's legs. Yujin struck the dragon's body with a powerful blow, causing everything around to sparkle with a bright aura and blood. That very painful moment when Yujin was held by the very guards who were supposed to protect him, Yu Yi-on told his guard to tell his brother that he was forbidden to provide a healer. Yu Yi-on ordered his guards to throw his brother out the door, providing only financial assistance. Yu Yi-on felt terrible. Experiencing a deep sense of guilt, he stood in front of his reflection with his head bowed. He told the guards to frame the whole situation as if he was forced to do this only because they were brothers. Yu Haiyan desperately punched the wall. Clenching his teeth, Yu Haiyan understood that such a situation would be better for his brother than if he went to die in the dungeon. Yu Haiyan was very ashamed in front of his brother and mentally asked Yu Jin for forgiveness. Yu Haiyan sat on the floor, resting his head on his crossed arms. Feeling hurt and annoyed by what had happened, he really wanted Yujin not to go to the dungeon under any circumstances. In the dungeon, where Yujin was fighting a fierce battle with the monster, it began to rain. Yujin held onto his staff. He stood on the dragon's dead body in the heavy downpour. The dragon's head, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, lay immobilized on the ground. Yujin, seeing with his own eyes the entire chronology of events, grinned maliciously. He ironically noted about his brother that he took too much upon himself, deciding to come up with such a plan, and without telling him anything. Yujin was soaked from the heavy rain and held onto his staff. Breaking into a mocking smile, he wondered what he should do now in such a situation, because he could not expect this, realizing that he still shackled the entire realization of his younger brother with his behavior. Yujin wondered what he would be doing now if he could survive. A shortcut appeared with a notification that Yujin received an impossible achievement by killing the dragon. Yujin suddenly looked at the icon, which said that he was being given the legendary title of Dragon Slayer. The protagonist widened his eyes when a bunch of notifications with rewards popped up in front of him. As a reward, he was given 10 gate stones, 5 acquired class 1 liquids, and the great sword of the Scarlet Dragon. The most important event was the wishing stone, which could fulfill his any desire. Yujin looked with anticipation at the shining crystal above the dead body of the dragon. The crystal emitted a bright light from itself. Floating in the air, Yujin thought about what he should choose as his wish. Yujin suddenly raised his hand to the crystal and made a wish for his brother to be resurrected. A notification came out that he could make any wish except to resurrect the dead. The teacher sat down near the stone and looked at it frantically. He was discouraged and did not understand what kind of wish he should make in this case. Yujin imagined himself in a new way as he stood at a crosswalk during a rainstorm and looked around. He thought about becoming the strongest hunter, a new hero. Yujin presented himself as popular when his face was shown on the city's big screens. He also thought that this time he could get the role that he had been jealous of for so long, noting that he could have wished for even greater honor. The main character was tormented in doubt about the choice of desires with his head down. His black silhouette with a sword behind his back stood under a heavy downpour. Yujin determined his wish and wished to turn back time to a time when his younger brother had not yet died. Shards of a shining crystal floated above the protagonist's hands. A notification popped up, asking if Yujin really decided to turn back time. Yujin looked at the stone suddenly and noted that this was the final decision. Suddenly, bright rays of light and air currents spread out from the crystal. Yujin humbly closed his eyes and awaited his further fate. He knew that he would not allow something like this to happen again. Yujin found himself in a different space, raising his eyebrows with a dumbfounded look. Yujin was dressed in normal casual clothes and sat on the sofa, looking around. It was a large, spacious office that was well lit. Yujin realized his hand and looked at it, trying to see the changes. He realized that he was in the main building of the Abyss Guild of his younger brother, realizing that he had indeed found himself in the past. The protagonist took out his phone and looked at the date and time. He realized that he had returned 5 years ago, wondering at the same time about that why this place. He grabbed his phone and began to study the date more carefully. It dawned on him that he had arrived on the day when he found the broker upon awakening. Yujin leaned his hand on the sofa and froze in the moment, realizing that now there would be a certain stage in his life. The footsteps of his brother were heard, who was about to enter his room. The door to the room began to open. Yujin cast his stunned glance towards his brother, who had entered, who bared his teeth slightly as he was very dissatisfied. Yu Haiyan frowned deeply and told his brother not to be in this room again. The main character looked in awe at his living younger brother. The protagonist rushed to run towards his brother, realizing that he was able to return. Yujin pulled his brother into a tight hug, causing Yu-Yun to throw his arms to the side and look confused. Yu-Yun looked at his brother questioningly. As Yu-Jin continued to hug his brother tightly, Yu-Jin was very happy that his brother Yu-Yun was alive. Yu-Yun continued to look at his brother, who was very happy about this meeting. Puzzled, without letting go of his brother's embrace, Yu-Jin apologized to his brother. The main character pressed his face into the body of his brother, who did not understand what was happening and why suddenly his older brother began to apologize for everything he could, noting his unreasonable behavior. The guys were in a spacious, bright office. Yu-Hyun frantically asked his brother that he could get into even bigger problems. Yu-Jin replied sharply that it was something else. Yu-Jin extended his hand behind his brother's head and pressed himself even closer to him. Yu-Jin said he just thought about it while walking to his office, noticing that he was 20 years old now, although he was 25 years old at the time of his death. Yu-Jin looked at his brother with excitement, as Yu-Yun looked at his brother with excitement. Yu-Jin happily noted that he would no longer create a fuss or cause problems for his brother. Yu-Yun looked at his brother very reverently as he turned to him. Yu-Yun, in response to such pleasant words, snuggled up to his older brother. Yu-Jin closed his eyes and smiled. He felt incredible relief, realizing that he was guilty before his younger brother. Yu-Jin remembered his little brother and himself when they returned from school. Playing with each other, Yu-Jin was incredibly happy that at least now he could return everything back. The little happy brothers were happy with each other and smiled. Yu-Jin understood that they were brothers who had no one but each other. Yu-Jin leaned away from his brother slightly. Still holding him, he approached Yu-Yun, telling him that he loved him very much. The main character thought to himself that now he will forget about Awakening and the hunters and will calmly sit in his place. Notification: the recording of the awakened Yu-Jin is completed. The protagonist excitedly raised his head, rejoicing at what was happening. Notifications came out that the legendary titles had been received: Dragon Slayer, an ideal educator. An additional skill called My Child is the Best was also launched. Yu-Hyun's pupil's growth rate was doubled, to which Yu-Jin was surprised. Delicious bacon and eggs and soup were cooking on the stove. Yu-Hyun put on an apron and prepared to eat. Turning towards his brother, Yu-Hyun said that everything will be ready soon, so Yu-Jin needs to wait a little and sit quietly. Yu-Jin answered happily. The main character was sitting at the table and waiting for his brother to prepare food. He felt awkward about the situation. Yu-Jin recalled how he had a heated argument with his brother at the same time and was about to leave home. At the moment, Yu-Yun was smiling with satisfaction and anxiously preparing food. Yu-Jin crossed his arms and waited with anticipation for Yu-Yun's dish to be ready. He was glad they made up, but he didn't expect them to have dinner together. Yu-Jin's expression changed slightly, and he raised his finger in the air, trying to bring up the status window. In the memory window, there was a red tag with his title of Dragon Slayer L, which proved that he had killed one of the Class 1 dragons alone. Yu-Jin didn't think that he would awaken like this again, trying to find out his rank. The protagonist touched the red label in the status window. He understood that the L class meant a legendary class, even stronger than the S class. The teacher spread his arms, sitting at the table, and watched as from more labels with different hieroglyphs appeared around the emblem with the dragon. Yu-Jin was surprised that he received 4 skills from this title alone. The protagonist looked at what was happening in shock. There were 4 emblems with different skills in the status window. There was Poison Resistant Cell, Curse Resistant Cell, Fear Resistant Cell, and Predator Lacheeta's SS. Yu-Jin realized that this was the first time he had seen such skills, especially L-class resistances that were supposed to be resistant to any poison, curse, and intimidation below legendary class. He also noted that he could still use double strength against representatives of dragons similar to Lacheeta's. Yu-Jin raised his hands in front of him and clenched his fists. He suggested that he could become the strongest after rolling back. The main character continued to clench his fists as he continued to carefully examine the window with his skills. Yu-Jin imagined a fight with a dragon. His brother and his comrade tried to hide from the attacks coming at them, noticing that the dragon's power was powerful, and this was the end for them. The dragon opened his mouth and was about to splash out a huge poisonous stream. Yu-Hyun understood that if they came into contact with the deadly poison that this dragon emitted, they would die suddenly. Yu-Jin's voice was heard from the side, telling the guys to move away. The main character covered Yu-Hyun's body with his arms outstretched to the sides. Yu-Jin threw his malicious grin towards his brother. Yu-Jin noticed that he arrived at the scene and sarcastically asked what they needed to do with the deadly poison. Yu-Jin sparkled and shone with a bright light, spreading a joyful smile. Yu-Yi-On looked at him questioningly as Yujin noted that the deadly poison was just a refreshing shower. For a true hunter, Yu Yeon noticed that his brother was cool. Yujin, with his fist raised, proudly imagined how he held his little brother in his arms to him. This sounded like the beginning of the legend of the Yujin Dragon's Lair. The protagonist, inspired by this idea of his life, clicked on the screen of his status window. He understood that this was how he would become the strongest hunter and be able to live well, noting that he would become the first representative of the L class. Yujin poked his finger on the black screen, choosing his skill level: Stamina 6, Strength 4, Agility 5, Intelligence 4, Mana 2. Yujin realized that his peak was F class and sadly imagined how the dragon would defeat him in this case. Yujin grabbed his head and pressed it to the table. When Yuyun looked at him questioningly, the main character understood that his body remained the same and tried to think about how he could use all these skills. The main character looked at the screen with annoyance and held his head. He noted with self-irony that this time there was nothing special about him either. There were two icons on the screen, with the skill buffing skill E and intelligence buffing E. He understood that the buff skills of agility and intelligence were E grade, which were similar to the previous skills. Yujin looked carefully at the screen and pressed his finger on the teacher icon. This was the title of teacher, which also changed to L class. Yujin looked at the skill screen indignantly, with one hand on his head. Yujin's finger touched one of the three skills called LS Final Gratitude. Realizing that it was better not to use it, Yujin also noticed that the names of all these ranks sounded disgusting. Yujin imagined the title of my child as the best L, seeing on the screen that he was communicating with his brother, and suddenly, unexpectedly, thanks to the code word, his brother suddenly began to emit a fiery aura from himself. This was the accelerated growth of an object under the influence of a code word. Validity period: 3 days. Yujin understood that this title was similar to the previous title of educator. Yuyun cast his puzzled glance towards his brother, who was very surprised at the increased growth rate. Yujin realized that Yuyun would become 2 times faster and stronger than other hunters, realizing that all this could be used with a skill called Our Child is So Incredible SS. The properties of this skill were that, if you support the object of education with a code word in front of more than 5 beings with intelligence, then the abilities and effect of the object skills increase relative to the number of living being, reaching 100% effectiveness. Yujin thought, holding his chin with his hand, that if he supports Yuyun in front of 50 people, he will become 5 times stronger, and if in front of 100, then he will become 2 times stronger. The protagonist imagined himself as a king, bathed in gold, and his red cape held by his brother and several other people. He imagined that in this way, he would be reborn as a teacher who raised an entire guild. He understood that if he was lucky and everything worked out so well, he would be able to live richly and happily all his life. Icon with code word, love. Yujin grabbed his head and leaned against the table in frustration, to which his younger brother immediately reacted. Yujin didn't understand who came up with such a terrible code word. Yujin remembered the moment when he held his brother and confessed his brotherly love to him. Yujin realized that the code word had changed during his awakening. Yujin, with tears in his eyes and irony, began to imagine how he walked around and confessed his love to everyone, even small children. He joked sarcastically to himself, realizing that if he walked around like that and threw around such words, he would simply be arrested and he would not be able to educate anyone. Yujin stood at the screen with a downcast face and pointed his finger at it. He was a little desperate and knew that it would all be useless since he wouldn't be able to use it. Noting that the skill itself was good on the screen, Yujin saw the latest skill called Promising Cutting. As Yujin looked at all the people around him and saw letters above their heads, this skill suggested that he could check the class of unawakened people and objects under the influence of the code word could awaken with optimal talents. Yujin looked pensive, still contemplating his bright future, when Yuyun walked over to the table and began serving food on plates. Yuyun looked at his brother and handed him a plate of rice. He asked if Yujin had enough rice. The main character gladly picked up a plate of rice and thanked his brother, saying that he would eat everything with great appetite. Yuyun noted that he cooked everything from what they had at home, so he didn't know what his dish tasted like. Yujin put a spoonful of rice in his mouth and began to chew it with a puzzled face. The protagonist continued to eat the rice with gusto, and the younger brother looked at it all with admiration. He was glad that he cooked deliciously, and Yujin noticed it. Yuyun looked at his brother warmly and added that if he wants more, then let him say so. Yujin began to look down in slight confusion as Suhayan began to explain the reason for this phenomenon. Yu Yeon replied, that it was safer to cook by himself because at that time there were items for detoxification and removal of curses, although such things had not existed before. Yujin asked if there were cases where people added poison or cursed food. Yu Yeon held the spoon in his hands and noticed that he was the only youth who performed alone and was restrained. Yujin recalled walking past a crowd of people who looked at him with contempt. He replied that there were other guilds that grew in agreement with large corporations, but he already knew then that he would not join anywhere and would create his own guild. Yujin immediately grabbed Yu Yun's face and squeezed it. Yu Yun added that if he had obediently entered a suitable guild, it would have been better, but he did not want that. Yujin worriedly grabbed Yu Hyan's face and brought it closer to him. Yujin was very angry with his brother for not telling him anything about this. Yu Hyan lowered his head in annoyance, telling Yujin to change his expression. The main character looked anxiously at his younger brother, who noticed that he had chosen this path himself. Yujin and his brother were sitting in the kitchen, near the sink. Yu Hyan said that one thing that constantly bothered him was that his behavior had caused his relationship with his brother to deteriorate. Yu Hyan recalled how he ordered his guards to limit their communication. Yu Hyan explained that he watched his every action and interfered in every matter, trying to make sure that Yu Hyan did not catch anyone's attention and deliberately moved away, afraid that they would touch his only brother. Yu Yun lowered his eyes in shame as Yujin put his hand on his shoulder and tried to cheer his brother up. Yujin noted that this should have been said right away, to which Yu Yun replied that he did not want to burden him. Yu Yun noted that if he had spoken later, Yujin would not have understood him. Yu Yun extended his hand to his shoulder, where Yujin's hand was. Yu Yun noted that he was wrong in his assumptions. Yu Yun looked at his brother in awe and carefully held his hand. Yu Yun warmly noted that Yujin still thought and worried about him, and also apologized and said warm words of love. Yu Yun broke out into a bright smile and closed his eyes, thanking his brother for saying such kind words despite him acting so disgustingly. Yujin looked at his brother with pride and sympathy. At that very second, Yujin began waving his chopsticks and smiling maliciously. He noticed that there was nothing to thank him for, because Yu Yeon had already suffered enough during his time, so he offered to try some delicious food. Yu Yeon happily agreed to this proposal. Jin sat with his brother at the table with food and looked peaceful. He was happy because he turned back time and it was the best day of his life. Yu Hyan, still chewing a piece of food, took out his phone and looked at it. Puzzled, Yu Hyan noted that he had a job and needed to go. Noting that he had one thing for Yujin to do, Yu Hyan stood up from the table and took off his apron. Yu Hyan turned to his brother and told him to delete the broker's contact. Upon awakening, Yujin immediately rushed to fulfill the condition, to which Yu Hyan added that in any case the broker would not answer him now, even though Yujin could try to contact him. Yu Hyan looked at his brother's phone with contempt, waiting for the number to be deleted. Yujin at this moment was thinking that Yu Hyan was unlikely to get rid of all brokers. Yu Hyan threw on his jacket and said goodbye to his brother, who waved goodbye to him. Yu Hyan replied that Yu Hyan could work peacefully and he would take care of the rest. Yu Hyan noticed that his brother was getting ready to go somewhere, so he tried to surprise him. Yu Hyan stopped at the exit and held his hand on the door. Yu Hyan noted that Yu Hyan will not go anywhere now. Yu Hyan looked at his brother, who was frozen in the moment by such a statement. Yu Hyan added that Yujin should not go out anywhere and live here in his house. Yu Hyan was shocked by what he heard and continued to hold his hand in the air. Sunlight filtered through the windows into the apartment. Yujin asked his younger brother what his words meant. The main character looked at Yu Hyan with confusion and puzzlement. His eyes wide. Yujin asked Yu Hyan why he couldn't leave the apartment. Yu Hyan looked at his older brother with concern. Smiling slightly, Yu Hyan told the main character that it was dangerous outside, so he shouldn't go out. Yu Hyan imagined the people around Yujin, who were looking at him with deceit and malice. Yu Hyan told his older brother that he was fine because he kept him at a distance, but now his enemies might target him, and there is no telling when they might make an attempt on his life. Yu Hyan pointed out that he couldn't let Yujin walk around alone. Yu Hyan told Yujin that this is precisely the reason why he cannot go out. Yu Hyan spread his arms to the sides, beaming with joy and smiling widely. Yu Hyan told his older brother that from now on, he will only be in that apartment. The main character looked at his younger brother with concern and panic. His mouth slightly open. Yujin rushed towards the door in a daze, not wanting to stay locked up. An obstacle appeared in front of Yujin's face that prevented him from passing, causing him to widen his eyes in fear. Yu Hyan looked at the main character with satisfaction. Smiling slightly, Yu Hyan reminded his brother that he said everything was fine. Yu Hyan remembered the moment when Yujin stood in front of him with his hand on his shoulder. Yu Hyan reminded his brother that he apologized to him, told him he loved him, and accepted everything he did. Yu Hyan closed his eyes in embarrassment and raised his finger to his nose. Tilting his head slightly, Yu Hyan told the protagonist what this meant to him. As if he had received permission, Yujin looked at his younger brother with despondency and incomprehension. The weather was beautiful outside. The main character did not understand how this could mean something like this. Yujin was lying on the floor, face down, among scattered things and boxes. The main character hurriedly began to pack his things into a backpack. Yujin said that he needed to take everything he needed and run away before his younger brother returned. The main character cautiously looked back at the apartment. Opening the front door, he thought that he would spend his whole life locked up if he was wrong. Kim stood in front of the open door, gloomily looking at the main character. Kim frowned unkindly and opened his mouth slightly. Yujin looked out of the door with wariness and fear, looking at Kim. The main character introduced Kim by holding his hands in front of him, clenched into fists. The protagonist noticed that this was a class abyss hunter, Kim, Yu Hyan's confidant, with a powerful defensive skill. The main character stood close to Kim. Yujin asked Kim to step aside. Kim objected negatively to the main character. Kim held the door with his hand. From where the main character looked out warily, Kim told the protagonist that Yu Hyan ordered to make sure he doesn't go out. The protagonist was surprised that his younger brother assigned in a class guard. Kim closed his eyes and sighed heavily, putting his hand to his face. Kim put his big hand on the main character's shoulder. Kim told the protagonist that he would not speak at length and ordered him to obediently return to the room. Kim held the main character by the shoulders, overwhelming him with his powerful aura. Kim told the protagonist that otherwise, he would push him there by force. The main character looked at Kim with numbness and anxiety. The protagonist was shaking with fear. He thought that he should not be afraid. Yujin opened his eyes in surprise. A notification window appeared in front of him. Activation of resistance to fear. The suppression is cancelled. The main character remembered the red icon with the image of ghosts. The protagonist noticed that his trembling disappeared thanks to the skill. Due to the use of the skill, the main character's eye briefly turned blue, after which it suddenly disappeared. In the eyes of the protagonist, Kim looked like a cute bear cub. Yujin noticed that Kim now looks not like a predator, but a meek puppy. The main character looked like an angry rabbit, baring his teeth. Yujin angrily asked Kim what he was trying to do. Kim frowned, looking seriously at the main character. Yujin angrily poked his finger at Kim's chest. The protagonist sarcastically asked Kim he really didn't know the laws of the Republic of Korea, noting that every person has the right to freedom, and locking him up like that is a crime. Kim could not restrain himself and grabbed Yujin by the collar of his jacket. The protagonist told Kim that he would go to jail, mentioning the policeman. Kim held the protagonist by the collar, lifting him up. Yujin looked ahead dejectedly. With his hands down, Kim told the main character that this was a punishment and sarcastically asked if he wanted him to continue dragging him to the room. Yujin apologized to Kim, answering him negatively. The protagonist looked depressed, thinking that with or without skill, no matter how hard the frog pouts, he won't become an ox. A red icon depicting a twig with leaves appeared before the eyes of the main character. Yujin noticed this skill without understanding what it was. A system window appears. A promising cutting is activated. The protagonist suddenly grabbed Kim by the face, pulling him closer. Yujin looked at Kim's surprised face. The main character saw information about Kim and his skill's possible awakening level at unwavering body. Acquisition failed. Regeneration. Acquisition failed. Expanse shield. The protagonist was surprised that Kim could awaken his S-class. The main character introduced Kim and Yu Hyan with their backs to each other. The main character thought that then there could be two S-class hunters in the abyss. Yujin began to pull Kim's ears and hair, staring intently at his face. The main character thought that maybe he could change this with his skill. The protagonist closed his eyes, knitting his eyebrows. System notification. Nurturing an object in a state of incompleteness. After using the code word, you can use my baby, the best, and get the S-class skills that you failed to obtain. Yujin was glad that he could change this after all. The protagonist imagined Kim calmly releasing him. The main character thought that he had found a solution to the problem in education, and that if he obediently raised Kim, he would obediently obey him. Yujin added that he would find himself an S-class and regain his freedom. The protagonist looked at Kim excitedly, pursing his lips. The main character thought that for education, it is necessary to say a code word, and that he should tell Kim that he loves. Kim furrowed his brows with rage as the veins popped out on his face. Kim didn't understand what Yujin was doing. The main character pointed decisively with his hand at himself. Knitting his eyebrows, the protagonist asked Kim to look where his hand was pointing. Yujin raised his hand, and with a confused smile, showed him a heart by folding to fingers. Kim looked gloomily, and made a gesture that the main character showed. The protagonist awkwardly winked at Kim, and showed his heart by folding his fingers. Kim became gloomy at the actions of the main character, and looked at him angrily. Kim told Yujin to stop making those nasty gestures, and go back to his room. The main character fell to his knees with a drooping look. Resting his hands on the floor, the protagonist really wanted the code word to be changed. It was night outside. Yu Haiyan returned home, looking at his older brother with a relaxed expression. The protagonist was lying on the floor, looking exhausted. Yu Haiyan asked Yujin if he had a good rest. The main character sarcastically answered his younger brother that he was dying. He told Yujin that the abyss has many enemies holding it back, but if they become the strongest, even they will not be able to touch them lightly, noting that then he too will be able to go out calmly. The protagonist imagined himself wearing a collar with a leash, which was held by a happy Yu Haiyan. The main character thought it looked like walking the dog. Suddenly, it dawned on the protagonist, causing his eyes to widen. He thought he could pull off something similar with his abilities. The main character recalled how he sat in front of the TV, looking at the hunters. Yujin thought that back then, he spent days searching for hunter-related information, and clearly remembered who would become a high-level hunter in the future. The protagonist imagined a lot of falling papers. He thought that if he found them in advance and appeased them, he could awaken them, and as payment for awakening, he would make them his guards. The main character imagined himself in a circle of powerful and cool hunters. He thought that if he became more authoritative this way, then Yu Yun would also not be able to do whatever he wanted. Yujin noted that with his skills and rank, this is quite possible. Yu Yun turned his thoughtful gaze to his older brother. The main character jumped up and smiled joyfully, pressing his hand to his chest. Yujin happily told his younger brother that he could find in a class hunter. Yu Yun looked at his brother in surprise and shock. Yujin knitted his eyebrows and smiled maliciously, clenching his hand into a fist. He thought he would dig up future as classes. Night hung over the city. Lanterns glowed on the streets. Yujin thought that since everything turned out this way, he would have to find small children who were easy to convince. Yerim stood in tattered and worn-out sneakers. She raised her head and fixed her gaze on the dark sky. The main character thought that he would carefully appease and raise him as a personal hunter. Yu Yun was surprised that Yujin wanted to find a class. The main character looked at his younger brother with enthusiasm. Holding out his hand, the protagonist asked Yu Yun to allow him to move freely if he found in a class personal bodyguard. Yu Yun looked at his brother in confusion, smiling awkwardly. Yu Haiyan wondered how his older brother would find a bodyguard. Yu Haiyan looked intently at his older brother. Waiting for an answer, Yu Haiyan told his younger brother that he has different ways. Yu Haiyan narrowed his gaze and lowered his eyebrows, looking at the main character seriously. Yu Haiyan assumed that Yu Haiyan had awakened. The main character imagined how he was shackled and his mouth taped, with Kim standing next to him with a whip in his hands. Yujin thought that he couldn't tell the truth about the L-class skill, otherwise he would be imprisoned forever. Yu Haiyan closed his eyes and raised his hand to his chin. He told the main character that with this, he would not become a target. The main character looked at his younger brother with a blank expression. Holding his hand, Yu Haiyan told the protagonist that an alternative awakening center would soon appear, noting that the entire awakening mechanism had been revealed. Yu-Gi-Oh thoughtfully scratched his cheek. Looking away to the side, the main character remembered that the center had not yet appeared at that time. The main character smiled lightly. Yujin told his younger brother that everything worked out well then. The main character smiled happily from ear to ear. Yujin told Yu Haiyan that his skill was useless, so he had nothing to worry about, adding that he would find an upgrade if he gave it a chance. The main character smiled insidiously. Knitting his eyebrows, he thought that his brother would not be able to keep him locked up according to his wishes, and would sweep away everyone from a 2S class. Yujin imagined S-class hunters holding him in their arms. The protagonist thought that he would quickly find them and increase his power, and thus he could even found a guild more serious than the Abyss. The sun was shining brightly above the building. The next day, Hunters Association of South Korea, place of registration of the awakened. The hunters opened their mouths wide in surprise, noticing that an Abyss shield, Hunter Kim, had appeared in the building. Kim looked around with a serious expression on his face. Yujin trailed behind Kim with his head down. The hunters in the building were staring at the main character, chatting among themselves. The hunters were surprised that Kim was assigned as a guard to the protagonist, thinking that he would become the new S-class. On the paper, one could see information about the main character and that he was registered as an F-class hunter. Hyojin held an envelope with money in his hand, imagining the image of his younger brother handing him the envelope. The main character opened the envelope and widened his eyes at what he saw. The check said 1 billion won. The sign said Floor 6 Fahrenheit Hunter Shopping Center. The sellers greeted the main character generously, and with wide smiles a girl with her hair tied up greeted the protagonist, asking him what equipment he wanted to start with. The protagonist was shown a box with small black earrings. The saleswoman said that they could offer him this as a simple accessory. Dark elf earrings. Mana plus 29 fusion put earrings on his ears, pursing his lips. The main character took gloves and a belt, putting it all on himself. Manticore leather gloves, stamina plus 6, strength plus 20 white cloth belt, agility plus 16. The protagonist opened the system window, thinking that his abilities would be C-class. The main character was looking around the store windows. Yujin said that he would take the contract and potions with the remaining money. Kim stood by the car with a menacing face, his hands folded on his chest. Kim asked the main character where he went. Yujin sat in the back seat of the car, fastening his seatbelt. Yujin told Kim that he was out shopping. Kim sternly told the main character to let him know when he was going somewhere, and added that if he had nothing else to do, then they would come back. The car slowly began to move. The main character told Kim that he needed to go to one more place. Yujin sat by the window, resting his head on his hand, and looked thoughtfully out the window. He thought that the ice which Yerim definitely lived somewhere in the area, noting that she had lost her parents and lived with relatives who owned a meat restaurant. The main character presented the image of Yerim, holding a spear around which ice was formed. Yujin recalled that Yerim was an excellent hunter even among the A-class, so this level should have satisfied Yu Yeon, noting that she would have to awaken in 3 years when she turned 18. The city at night was illuminated by the light of street lamps. The protagonist thought that he needed to quickly find her and enter into a contract with her in order to regain his freedom. A crowd of people was walking in the market. The woman with the black bag looked at the main character in surprise. She told him that she didn't know any Yerim. The man in the mustard scarf shook his head negatively. He told the main character that they don't have Yerim in their restaurant. Yujin looked around, holding a snack in his hand. Kim walked with a menacing look. Looking straight ahead, the main character noticed that there were more meat restaurants than he expected, and he would have to go around them all. The protagonist felt a delicious smell and closed his eyes. Sniffing with pleasure, he noticed that it was the smell of roasting meat. The market was hung with garlands and signs. Yujin asked Kim if he was hungry, suggesting they eat first. Kim replied to the main character that he was fine. The main character chewed his snack carefully. Looking at Kim, Kim asked the protagonist why they came there. Since there was a meat restaurant next to the abyss, Yujin told Kim that he felt a strong energy there. Kim furrowed his eyebrows. Looking away in disbelief, Kim muttered under his breath that this was a complete scam. The main character closed his eyes, about to take a bite of his snack in his hands. An angry Yerim stood nearby. The protagonist thought that first he needed to have dinner and then continue his search. Noticing that he wanted to eat Kopchen, Yerim screamed furiously that it always her fault. The main character looked at Jam in surprise, his eyes widening. Yerim furrowed her eyebrows and opened her mouth wide. Yerim told her uncle that it was all because of that man Park Soo-kun's. An angry man looked out from the restaurant. Yerim took off her apron and turned her back to the man. Running away from him, the man told Yerim in a commanding tone to come back. Yerim shouted in rage that she hated everything and it would be easier to die. Yerim, with a downcast look, ran past the main character, who looked at her in bewilderment. The protagonist opened his mouth slightly, recognizing the girl. He thought that he had finally found Yerim. Yerim frowned and clenched her teeth, running wherever her eyes were looking. Yujin will extend his hand after the fleeing Yerim. The main character handed his snack to Kim and with a serious look looked in the direction where Yerim ran away. Kim looked at Yujin in bewilderment. The main character asked Kim to hold his snack for a while. The protagonist followed Yerim. Knitting his eyebrows, he thought that Yerim was very fast for someone who was not awakened. A bright blue light began to emanate from Yujin's feet. The main character had to use a B-class item, a light fabric belt, agility plus 16. The protagonist accelerated, emitting blue light from his feet, and ran after Yerim. Yujin noticed that with his equipment, high speed is nonsense for him. The main character ran past people, raising a strong wind. He thought the equipment was the best thing in the world. Many people were walking around the market. Yujin ran, looking at Yerim in the crowd. The main character saw Yerim running away. Yerim turned around, looking at the main character in surprise. The protagonist called out to her, asking if she was Yerim's student. Yujin ran closer and closer to Yerim. His mouth wide open. The main character wanted to talk to the student. Yerim thought that her uncle had sent it. Yerim moved from her place, running out onto the roadway. She called the protagonist uncle, telling him to leave as she had no intention of coming back. Yujin didn't like that she called him uncle, noting that he was in the prime of his life. The main character opened his eyes wide. Looking at Yerim with concern, the protagonist noticed that there was a car on the road. The car was shining its headlights brightly as it approached Yerim. Yerim was numb with horror. Her eyes widening, a blue burst of energy appeared. The main character released blue energy, bounced off the car, and grabbed Yerim. The main character collapsed to the ground, along with Yerim. The driver of the car widened his eyes in fear. A crowd of people watched with shocked faces. Yerim looked at the main character in confusion, her mouth slightly open. Yujin asked her if she was okay. The protagonist looked at Yerim with relief. Smiling slightly, the main character told Yerim that he wanted the ending to be cooler. Yerim sat on the back of the main character, resting her foot on his face. Yerim noticed that the main character was a hunter. Yujin invited the student to get up from his back. There was a grill on the table on which meat was being fried. The main character closed his eyes and smiled joyfully. Drooling, Yujin said that the texture of the meat was simply killer, noting that he had not eaten marbled beef for a long time. Yerim held a green pepper in her hand, dipping it into the sauce. She noticed that the main character called himself the elder brother of the head of the abyss. Yerim looked intently at the main character, biting the pepper. She didn't understand why such a person needed her. Yujin closed his eyes, raised his hands to his chin, and smiled widely. He jokingly told Yerim that it was because good energy emanated from her. Yerim turned around sharply and was about to get up from the table. Yerim thanked the main character for the food, saying that she didn't believe it at all. The protagonist looked away, smiling awkwardly. Imagining himself with his little brother and a man with a woman, he told Yerim that he knew her parents, adding that when his parents passed away, they helped him. The main character noticed in his head that this was a lie. The main character picked up the fried meat with tongs. The protagonist told Yerim that he was thinking about how he could help her, noting that his strength turned out to be outstanding. Yujin looked at the student with a slight smile. Raising his hand to his chest, he told her that his ability was to awaken other people. Yerim held a bowl of food in her hands and looked at the main character in surprise. The protagonist told Yerim that she can awake and at least be class. There were 2 black cards on the table. Yujin told Yerim that he was under the protection of the abyss, so he could help her get a good job as a huntress. The main character looked at Yerim with hope. Crossing his fingers, Yujin told Yerim that he wants to sponsor her if she doesn't mind. The protagonist extended his hand with a friendly smile. Yerim looked at the main character with confusion. Yujin asked the student if she would become a huntress by entering into a contract with him. Yerim widened her eyes in shock, raising her eyebrows. The main character watched Yerim with interest. He thought that Yerim was hooked since hunting was considered the coolest profession among teenagers, adding that he needed to put on a show to lure her in. The main character raised his hand and opened his inventory. Yujin took out a shining scroll with a feather from his inventory. The protagonist suggested to Yerim that she read the contract. A shining contract flew up to Yerim's face. Yujin told the student that all she had to do was officially sign a contract as the huntress Yerim. Yerim looked at the contract with delight, blushing slightly. There were hieroglyphs inscribed on the contract. Yerim read the conditions, which included entering into a contract with the Abyss Guild, keeping Yujin's skill a secret, and being responsible for guarding Yujin for a year. The protagonist leaned his hand on the table and smiled awkwardly from ear to ear. The main character told Yerim that he would not be ashamed, because after awakening, she would be much stronger than him. Yerim asked Yujin if she could become independent after awakening. Yerim lowered her head, looking sadly at the contract. The main character suddenly grabbed his pen. Yujin asked Yerim to wait. Yerim didn't understand what to expect, thinking that just writing the name was enough. Yujin told Yerim that everything needs to be checked carefully, adding that the contract doesn't even have her terms. Yerim looked at the contract in confusion, her mouth slightly open. The main character moved closer to Yerim, pointing his finger at the contract. Yujin warned Yerim what would happen if she was deceived when signing rashly. The main character looked questioningly at the student. Raising his eyebrows, the protagonist added that even if independence looks alluring, you need to be careful. Yerim asked what to do then if this guardian is deceiving her. Yujin looked at Yerim blankly. Yerim narrowed her eyes slightly, frowning. The student did not understand the point of a guardian deceiving her and monitoring the fulfillment of the contract, noting that everything would simply be taken away from her. Yerim kept her hands on her knees, clutching her clothes tightly. The main character did not understand what the student was talking about. The guys looked excitedly in the direction where the source of the noise appeared. The student's uncle searched everywhere for her, shouting her name. An angry Uncle Yerim appeared at the establishment. The uncle told the student that he had been told where she was. The guys quickly got up from the table. The main character greeted Uncle Yerim appeared at the establishment. The uncle told the student that he had been told where she was. Uncle told Yerim that she was not doing what she was told, but was chilling somewhere. The uncle furiously frowned on his face and grabbed Yerim's hand. The uncle told Yerim in a commanding tone to follow him, adding that he would correct her habits. The main character asked Uncle Yerim to calm down. Yujin grabbed his uncle's hand tightly. The uncle directed his furious gaze at the protagonist. The main character looked at his uncle in shock. Yerim's uncle asked Yujin who he was and how close he was to Yerim. The protagonist told his uncle that there was nothing like that between them. The main character held his uncle's hand, baring his teeth. The uncle did not understand where the main character got such strength. Yujin thought it was all thanks to his equipment. The uncle contorted his face with rage. Yujin turned his gaze to Yerim. The student's uncle asked the protagonist to let go of his hand and displeasantly asked him who he thought he was interfering in their affairs. Yujin raised his eyebrows and looked at Yerim in surprise. Yerim stood slightly cowed, looking away to the side. The main character noticed the worn-out and old sneakers on the student's feet. Yujin remembered how he saw Yerim and his uncle quarrel outside the establishment. The main character opened his mouth slightly. Yujin told Yerim that now he understood what she was talking about. The protagonist looked angrily at the student's uncle, squeezing his hand harder. Yujin told Yerim that she meant that nothing is better than such a guardian. Yerim furrowed her eyebrows and opened her mouth wide. Yerim told the main character that he is absolutely right and her uncle is the worst. Yerim pointed her finger at her uncle. The main character narrowed his eyes and glared at him, causing him to hesitate. Yerim told the protagonist that her uncle stole her parents' entire inheritance and did not give her a penny of pocket money. Uncle Yerim frowned with anger and bared his teeth. He told the student that she was always disgracing people. The student's uncle walked towards Yerim, throwing the main character aside. Yujin suddenly fell to the floor. Yerim and uncle widened their eyes as they looked at Yujin. Yerim looked at the main character excitedly. Her mouth parted. Uncle Yerim knitted his eyebrows, looking at Yujin in bewilderment. The protagonist sat on the cold floor with his head down. Yerim asked Yujin if he was okay. The main character rolled on the floor in horror, his mouth wide open. Yujin shouted to the entire establishment that Uncle Yerim was beating people. The protagonist sat on the floor, closing his eyes, pressing his hand to his chest. Yujin told his uncle that he could talk normally and not push people. Noting that he just stopped the student, the main character looked at Uncle Yerim with a pitiful look, letting tears flow from his eyes. The uncle grabbed the main character by the clothes, pulling him slightly towards him. The protagonist looked down with a serious look. Yujin tripped up the student's uncle. Uncle flew onto the table, sweeping plates off it. The main character rose to his feet and held a can of soda in his hands. With a smile, the protagonist told his uncle to be careful because the soda had spilled and the floor was now slippery. The uncle raised his head and looked furiously at the main character. Yujin grabbed his uncle's head, pressing it to the table. Yerim knitted her eyebrows and watched what was happening with a smile. Barely holding back her laughter, the main character asked his uncle if he was okay because he slipped again. The protagonist held his uncle's head over the hot grill and leaned slightly towards him. Yujin asked his uncle how he dared to steal from a small child, threatening him with violence. The main character looked at his uncle angrily. Yujin warned the student's uncle not to dare treat Yerim like hell again. The main character turned his head to the side and saw Yerim smiling joyfully. The student noticed that this hit on the table. The sound was just like in wrestling. Yujin told Yerim that the sound was not from him, noting that he heard it from the street. The guys looked at the street in surprise, their mouths slightly open. The restaurant building began to shake violently. People in the building thought that an earthquake or war had started. Kim ran into the restaurant. In a panic, Kim called out to the main character at the top of his lungs. People opened their mouths in horror at what they saw. Kim told all people to evacuate carefully. A huge black monster with worm-shaped eyes was destroying buildings. People in panic tried to escape from the terrible monster. Kim said that there was a dungeon break nearby. The guys looked at Kim in shock, their mouths agape. Kim told the guys to move away because it was dangerous there. Kim stood in a fighting position, clenching his hand into a fist, and a golden icon with a shield and a mountain appeared in front of his hand. Kim told the guys that he would stop him. Kim hit the ground with all his might, stopping the huge monster. System notification defense skill, class shield of space. A wall of earth appeared in front of the monster, blocking its path. Kim watched the monster. The main character watched in horror. What was happening? Kim told the protagonist to take the chance and evacuate quickly. The main character watched the monster. With confusion, Hyojin thought that there was no such thing in his memories, and why did the monster suddenly appear? The main character was in a daze. Kim sat on his haunches, looking towards the monster with a serious look. The protagonist recalled that in the past, at the same time, there was no dungeon breakout. Kim jumped off the ground and rushed at the monster. Kim flew into the air, swinging his leg at the monster. Kim kicked the monster with all his might, releasing a golden burst of energy. Kim rested his foot on the monster's body. Kim frowned. Looking at the monster with bewilderment, Kim noticed that the monster had no base. The monster began to attack Kim with its tentacles. Kim jumped over the wall, dodging the blows. The monster followed Kim and began to climb over people. Ran away from the wall in panic. Yerim ran, turning back in panic. The uncle ran away from the wall in horror, not understanding what was happening. The laces on the sneakers came undone, and Yerim stepped on the lace. The student fell to the ground. The uncle looked at Yerim and ran on. The student looked in front of her with displeasure, baring her teeth. The monster's tentacles were approaching Yerim. Yerim closed her eyes and opened her mouth slightly. The main character covered Yerim with a shield, preventing the tentacles from passing through. The student widened her eyes in surprise, looking at the protagonist. Yujin bared his teeth while holding a huge shield in his hand, from which a bright light emanated. The protagonist looked at Yerim with a serious look. The main character told the student to quickly run to the shelter. Yujin grabbed Yerim's hand and rushed with her, running away from the monster. Yerim slightly opened her mouth and looked at the back of the main character in confusion. The student knitted her eyebrows and looked down sadly. An entrance to the ground appeared in front of the guys. The main character asked Yerim if the hideout was located there. In the underground shopping center, Yerim told the main character that everything was correct. The protagonist turned behind him, looking at Yerim. Yujin told Yerim to quickly go down there. The protagonist narrowed his gaze and frowned at the student. Yujin told Yerim that he needs to go back. The main character recalled hunters attacking the same monster. The protagonist thought that he had seen this type of monster, and alone they are weak, so they move in a pack, noting that if they are not quickly gotten rid of, they become a complete headache. Kim formed a golden shield in front of him. Kim defended himself from the monster's furious blows. The main character thought that since Kim specializes in defense, he does not have a separate skill for area attack, adding that with such an opponent is the least suitable specialization. The protagonist nervously looked ahead. Frowning, Yujin thought that he needed to find a way to defeat the monster at all costs. Yerim grabbed the protagonist's hand. She told the main character that she would also go, and asked him to wake her up, noting that she could go fight. Yerim was full of confidence and looked at the main character intently. The student widened her eyes in shock, pursing her lips. Yujin told Yerim that this is precisely why she is not allowed to, since she is still a child. The protagonist approached the student and put his hands on her shoulders. He told Yerim that she would not fight skillfully once she awakened, adding that he wanted to awaken her calmly and painlessly, and did not intend to immediately throw her into real combat. Yujin remembered his little brother when he awakened and had to fight monsters. Yujin told Yerim that he could calmly watch the child be forced to fight alone. The protagonist turned around and looked at the student one last time. Yujin told Yerim that adults should deal with this and she should get to the shelter safe and sound. Yerim watched as the main character ran towards the monster. The protagonist rushed headlong. Baring his teeth, Yujin tried to think of a way to help defeat the monster. The main character knitted his eyebrows, looking in the direction of the monster. With irritation, Yujin thought that he had been hanging around as a hunter for more than 5 years, and even in this state, he could squeeze some kind of decision out of himself. The protagonist ran up to Kim. Kim turned behind him, looking at the main character in surprise. Kim looked at the main character with displeasure. Kim didn't understand why Yujin came, and told him that it was dangerous there. The main character told Kim to use the defense skill. The monster's tentacles peeked out from behind the wall. Kim told the main character that this was useless, and even with a protective barrier, it would not be possible to completely enclose the center. The main character knitted his eyebrows and looked at Kim with all confidence. The protagonist told Kim that this skill would be enough since he had an idea. Kim widened his eyes in surprise, looking at Yujin. The men stand on a rock and look down at the monster. One man makes a vague movement with his hands as his companion holds his palms on the rocky surface. The man raises his hand to strike when a golden glow appears around it. This moment attacks the ground when the yellow seal becomes larger. This hit deals damage to some terrible substance. This monster is in a rage. A large crack appears in the ground. A man sits while his companion stands, and a green seal appears under his foot. One person argues that such a situation is unexpected. Yujin claims that he is already heading in some direction. The guy pushes away from an emerald-colored spot. He deftly jumps on the rocky surface. Yujin touches the stone with his fingers while performing the trick. He thinks that the protective barrier is like a solid wall, and if you put it around the monster, it will become such a cage for him. The woman shows some paraphernalia in the suitcase when the guy looks at them carefully and puts his hand to his chin. He thinks about the item that was purchased from the hunting association. Green granules are in a box. He adds that it is a class of deadly poison, namely the limitless black poison pill. A man holds an emerald ball in his hand. He thinks that his purchase is quite good. The guy with the short hair is getting ready to throw that pill forward. He reasons that if he blows up this device inside the barrier and closes it, this will mean his victory. Yujin opens his eyes wide in surprise. He says that with a detailed situation, he will be able to kill the monster instantly. Empty gorge of a large mountain. Yujin is surprised that the monster is missing. He opens his mouth and gets nervous when the monster appears behind him. The guy asks himself where his opponent disappeared to. Dark tentacles envelop a man's leg. The monster suddenly lifts Yujin into the air. A guy with short, smooth hair becomes more gloomy. He thinks that the monster got out through the drain. Someone strikes with an umbrella. Yujin remembers that there was no such information, so he didn't think about it, and then wonders if this is the end of him. Yerim opens his mouth wide and holds an umbrella in his hands. The girl calls her uncle. She deals multiple attacks to the monster that is holding Yujin. The monster lets go of the guy's leg. He lands on his feet and runs after Yerim. The girl turns to her uncle, asks him to run, and warns him that there is an alley in a certain direction. A guy with short cocoa-colored hair quickly runs with Yerim from their opponent. He asks his comrade what she is doing here. He ordered all civilians to evacuate. The girl asks her uncle what he is doing, if he is a representative of Class F. The tentacles of the monster are heading after the heroes. Yujin claims that he is an adult, and awakened Yerim warns his interlocutor not to make her laugh. She asks if this is the person who asked the student of the neighboring school for protection. The guy looks at the girl, who opens her mouth wide and closes her eyes. He claims that he already warned Yerim that she was still quite small. She says that she knows about this, which is why she needs even more strength. A girl with an interesting hair color looks forward sadly. Yerim and Yujin hold hands and run in a certain direction. She argues that when her uncle slept with her recently, the girl was able to calm down because she assumed that her new acquaintance really wanted to protect her. The schoolgirl looks down sadly. She thinks that such behavior could anger her. The heroes run in a certain direction. The girl explains that she does not have the strength to protect herself on her own. Buildings on the street in the city. She claims that this is the reason the girl wants to become stronger. A little girl looks in an unknown direction. She explains that she previously did not have the opportunity to do anything because of her age. An unknown person runs in the rain. People are running away from the child. Yerim adds that she doesn't want to wait for help while she's worried. Someone is running fast enough. The girl claims that she wants power that she can choose on her own, with which she can protect herself. She frowns and looks ahead resolutely. A girl with an unusual color of curls turns to her uncle and reminds him of his own words. A guy with short, smooth hair looks down in surprise. Yerim claims that she has such a power that can make a girl more powerful. She and Yujin run forward from their opponent. The student asks her friend to show her how much stronger she can become. The heroes raise their heads and are quite surprised. They shake hands when a blue glow appears around them. A bright flash of light appears. The man is holding a weapon in his hand. He asks how a situation like this could end this way. The man opens his eyes quite strongly in surprise. Something approaches the girl's hand, over which a blue seal appears. A school student smiles happily as she holds her palms above her head. The world system notifies that Yerim has activated a skill called Icy Breath, and the girl has completed her registration. She calls her uncle and notifies him that she has received an S rank. The short-haired man looks ahead. Dumbfounded, Yerim claims that she has developed some cool skills. Her friend claims that no one speaks loudly about their skills. The monster pulls its limbs upward. Yerim asks how her uncle feels about her new opportunities. A girl with an unusual color of curls looks forward. When a monster appears behind her, the guy warns his partner about the appearance of a monster. The enemy's tentacles wrap around the wrist of a school student. Her uncle tries to warn her that she needs to be careful. The men watch as their comrade gets scared and hits the wall. Her colleagues are in shock. The girl looks in surprise at the monster she slammed into the rocky surface. Yujin thinks that this kind of power is common for S-class. Yerim clenches his hands into fists and smiles happily. She assures that she will cope further on her own. A schoolgirl approaches a tall man and stretches out her hands to a certain staff. She asks her friend to lend her a weapon. He agrees with trepidation. The end of the staff rests on the ground as a blue glow appears around it. A pillar of light appears as Yerim delivers the killing blow. A man creates yellow shields to protect himself and his friend from rocks. Yujin asks for help. A blue stamp appears under the girl's feet. The game system notifies that the Hermes shoes skill is about to be activated. There is a flash of bright light due to Yerim's powerful attack. A man protects his friend from falling rocks as he raises his hand into the air. Yujin loudly calls the girl's name and urges her to be more careful, since in this case, they will be crushed to death. A guy with short, smooth hair looks with displeasure at a school student who is floating in the air. Yerim apologizes and explains that she still doesn't have good control over her power. Yujin puts his hand to his forehead and smiles with pleasure. Some man extends his hand forward and looks ahead gloomily. The guy talks about how, as a hunter, this person was called an ice witch. The girl grins happily and closes her eyes. Yujin thinks that his new friend turned out to be a child who is capable of a sincere smile. The guy with short hair raises his head up. He says that he could not expect the girl to awaken so unexpectedly, and adds that it would be great if she had the opportunity to launch an attack over a large area. Another man claims that his partner can leave something like this for him. Someone extends their hand forward as a burgundy aura appears around it. A certain person is preparing for a powerful attack when Yujin and his friend are watching him. Yuyun looks ahead resolutely. Someone calls this person by name. A schoolgirl watches her companion's deadly attack. She opens her eyes wide in surprise. The monster's body is burning. The girl is surprised that the guy was able to burn the enemy with his first attack. The guy raises his hand and sends fiery blows upward. The man frowns and looks ahead resolutely. The schoolgirl looks down with admiration. The guy is standing on the ground among the rubble and stones. He looks with interest at the girl with the unusual color of her curls. Yujin looks at the gloomy Yuyun. He calls his friend by name and is glad that he came. The guy turns his head to the side. Yerim sinks to the ground and watches as the guy in the raincoat scolds Yujin. He asks him he knows how worried Yuyun was when his friend called him on the way to the scene of the tragedy, and then mutters something about how many times he needs to be reminded not to be outside at such moments. Yujin points his hand forward, and the men turn their heads in the right direction. The guy with the short, sleek hair claims that everything is fine, and his friend doesn't need to worry so much. Yujin points to Yerim. The guy claims that he has found a person whose S-class has recently awakened. A girl with an unusual color of curls awkwardly greets the new person. She is embarrassed. The girl thinks that this man's eyes really look like abysses. The guy puts his finger to his face and is quite nervous. He mutters something incomprehensible. Yuyun is in a state of shock and horror. Yujin says that he wanted to become her guardian. The friends argue and wave their arms as Yerim gives the weapon to another man. Yuyun asks if the person across from him really wants to become a trustee rather than a sponsor. A girl with an unusual color of curls thanks for the staff that was lent to her and asks how these concepts differ. The man moves his eyebrows towards the bridge of his nose. He claims that a simple sponsor cannot interfere in the affairs of his ward, for which reason he would not be able to protect him in any way. The girl opens her eyes and mouth. Her friend argues that the caregiver can do things that the sponsor is not allowed to do, and is the one who plays the role of the parent. Yerim asks his interlocutor again. Yuhayan becomes darker and more angry. The girl is trying to say something. He pulls his friend away from the surprised Yerim. The guy in the cloak claims that he cannot allow such a situation to occur to ensure Yujin's safety. The guy in the cloak points his finger forward. He wonders if there could be a situation where this girl attacks Yujin. Yerim grits her teeth and becomes more gloomy. She claims to be a kind person. Yu-yun gets angry and opens his mouth wide. He says that he would rather become a trustee of this school student. A girl with an unusual color of curls frowns. She counters that she doesn't want this since her uncle promised her that he would do it. Yujin tries to calm his friends down. Yu-hyun tries to take his friend home. He claims there is nothing negotiable here. The girl grabs Yu-hyun's hand. She asks where Yu-hyun is taking her savior, and then claims that this man cannot interfere with their agreement. A guy with short hair becomes more gloomy due to severe shoulder pain. Yu-hyun and Yerim fuss over their friend. The guy in the raincoat calls Yujin's name and asks if he's okay. A girl with an unusual hair color panics. The patient asks the two archers to move away from him. Yujin points his finger at the man in the cloak. Yu-hyun asks his friend if he needs to drink a healing potion. A guy with short, smooth hair tilts his head down. He asks the tall man if he really raised him this way. Yujin presses his finger into his friend's chest, gets angry, and opens his mouth. He claims that choosing a trustee is Yerim's right, while he should rejoice as the head of the guild that a person of S rank has joined. Yu-yun tries to object to his comrade. Yu-yun looks ahead dumbfounded. He assures that they will definitely talk later, and he will quickly finish work and return. The girl with an unusual hair color folds her arms across her chest, while the guy rests his palms on his hips. The school student is nervous and looks at her new guardian. She apologizes, explains that she currently has control over her power, and then asks what condition Yujin's shoulder is, and he claims that this is an ordinary slight dislocation. The guy picks up his sneaker from the ground. He says that these are Yerim's shoes, but since she cannot control her power, he puts them on. Yujin looks down and puts the shoe on the school student's foot. He claims that she is quite old and the wrong size for a girl, and then curses at the student's uncle. A girl with an unusual color of curls looks forward with excitement. Yujin warns that tomorrow they will definitely go and buy Yerim new shoes. The girl smiles happily when the guy with short, smooth hair looks down with concentration. The school student laughs and says that such an attitude makes her tremble. Yujin can't understand what his ward is talking about. The girl suddenly notices a fly. She tries to explain that this kind of feeling is usually depicted in dramas. A school student tries to kill a midge, but injures Yujin. She mutters something about insects. Blood appears on the face of a guy with short hair. The girl raises her hands up, and her new guardian grabs his chest. He claims that this is not trepidation, but that his heart will soon break. Yerim apologizes and assures that she will be more careful. The starry sky is above the city. Yujin claims that he cares. He ties his sneakers. The guy reminds his interlocutor that she recently asked him why he commits such actions. He closes his eyes and smiles. He says that he does this because the story of this girl does not seem alien to him, due to the fact that his parents died when he was little. The boys hug each other tightly. Yujin states that he sometimes thinks about how things would have been different if they had had a strong base back then. The girl looks down with interest. Her new guardian says he understands that he may not appear reliable enough. The school student opens her mouth. She assures that Yujin is a reliable person. She smiles widely and clenches her hand into a fist. Yujin grins and extends his palm forward. He also asks you to take good care of him. The fists of these people touch. The guy looks up with excitement. He claims that, of course, this can never compare with the love of parents. The girl looks down in surprise. The guy counters that he loves Yerim. A high school student raises her hand to her chest and laughs loudly. She asks why her new guardian said that. The world system notifies that the girl who recently awakened her ankh has received a positive effect from the code word. The girl's uncle runs in a certain direction. He calls his niece by name, namely Yerim. He looks at a girl with an unusual color of curls and her new guardian. This man claims that he was afraid for his ward because he could not find her for a long time. Uncle is nervous and smiles wryly. He asks his niece if she has truly awakened. Yujin and Yerim become more gloomy. The girl's relative claims that people with high ranks earn a lot of money. A guy with short, smooth hair thinks that they still have a detailed problem. The guardian ran up to those standing and spread his hands, saying that he was very worried when he lost the girl. Yerim sighed, turning away when she heard the words that it's not about that now, that she woke up. Is it true? The man beamed with joy when the girl told him her class, saying that now a mountain of money awaits them. Yujin coughed into his fist, and Yerim turned to him and said that she was leaving the house because she now had a contract with him, to which the guardian asked again in surprise. Frowning and steaming with anger, he shouted, asking why a 16-year-old girl would leave the house. To this the girl replied that she was 15. Yujin intervened. He approached the man and said that according to a special law, a hunter can become independent from the age of 14. The man looked at the smartphone the guy held out and angrily yelled that he was hearing about the special law for the first time. Let him stop talking nonsense. Yujin looked at him seriously, holding out a smartphone with a voice recorder recording that voiced the words of their recent dialogue. Phrases were heard from the phone that we could talk normally. Why was he pushing him? The man was going to hit her like that, a weak high school student. The guardian, stuttering, asked what it was. The guy showed the recording to the amazed man, saying that he would still get recordings from CCTV cameras, and Yerim was surprised that he was recording everything from the very beginning. The girl listened as they argued. Yujin said that the fact that he was a bad guardian had become clear a long time ago, and recently he completely abandoned this child, running away, to which the man shouted, asking when did this happen. Swift movement flashed past the smartphone. The man grabbed the brunette by the clothes and shouted, calling him names and saying that he had planned this from the very beginning. Yujin frowned, silently looking at the man who was yelling that he would sue him. Yerim raised the blue umbrella she was holding in her hands. With force, she lowered the umbrella into the ground between the surprised debaters, and from the impact of the umbrella, bright blue rays of light flew in all directions. From the impact of the umbrella, the ground cracked and smoke. The guardian asked in surprise what it was. The girl, clutching an umbrella with both hands, listened as he stammered and said that the awakened should not harm ordinary people. Yerim raised her shining eyes to him and looked with the most innocent look. Beaming, she innocently asked what he was talking about, what to do if he constantly let go of his hands. The man asked again what she was talking about and, turning to Yujin, said that he, too, saw that she hit her like that on purpose. With a slight movement, the girl broke the umbrella in half along with the fabric and knitting needles. The guardian looked at this in fear, hiccuping with fear. With a sweet and wide smile, the girl charmingly asked, "What is uncle talking about?" She approached the startled man like a red cloud, clutching a broken umbrella, and asked if he pushed the guy, and then just fell, didn't he? Sweating with fear, the man thought, is this really the high school student he saw every day at home? The hair of the furiously burning girl was flying, her eyes were burning, and the umbrella in her hands was crumpled into a ball. The guardian thought that he was standing in front of some kind of predator. Yujin scratched his neck thoughtfully, activating his fear resistance ability, and thought that this intimidating aura showed that she was definitely S rank. Feet in worn-out sneakers slowly walked towards the man. The girl said that he himself should know that he was not in a position for her to be grateful to him. The enraged girl squeezed the umbrella, crumpled into a ball, tighter in her hands. The man fell to the ground in fear, and Yerim threw a lump of umbrella and said that guardian, this word is funny. He didn't even buy her a pathetic umbrella. The man looked in fear at the remains of the umbrella lying nearby, and the girl continued, saying that if she had her way, she would have turned it into this. He hiccuped in fear when the girl grabbed his shirt, saying that now she would just turn a blind eye to this. Did he know why? Approaching the man's face, Yerim said that it was because he was worthless. The man was not worth even an ounce of her attention. She looked at him menacingly. Towering menacingly over her frightened guardian, the girl advised him to remember this and continue to live his worthless life, and if he does not follow her advice and continues to cling to her or make a row with Yujin, attracting attention to himself. The girl menacingly placed her hands on and declared that then she would definitely not turn a blind eye to this.